New York is raising the age required to own semi-automatic rifles. New Yorkers under age 21 will not be allowed to buy semi-automatic rifles under a new law signed by Governor Kathy Hochul yesterday. This makes the state one of the first to enact a prominent gun control initiative following a series of mass shootings over the past month. Hochul signed 10 gun-related bills, including one that will require micro-stamping in new firearms, according to NBC New York. Another law revised the state's red flag law. New York is also requiring more monitoring efforts on social media amidst this wave of gun violence. Let's take a look.
And in the state of New York, we're now requiring social media networks to monitor and report hateful conduct on their platforms. Thank you, Senator Anna Kaplan, and thank you, Assemblymember Patricia Fahey.
72% of the nation believe mass shootings are preventable, according to a new CBS News poll. But CBS's elections and surveys director, Anthony Salvanto, explains there is a partisan split, with 44% of Republicans saying mass shootings are something we must accept.
The good news is people think this is preventable. You get big majorities that say it can be stopped, it can be prevented, and it's not something that we have to accept. Now, there is a quarter who says that unfortunately this may be something that we have to accept in a free society, and I do want to point out some partisan difference here. There is bipartisan view that it can be prevented, but there are 4 in 10 Republicans who do say that it may be something we have to accept. And that partisan difference is going to cut through a lot of this.
Executive Director at Ultraviolet, Shauna Thomas, and GOP strategist Malik Abdul join us now to weigh in. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
So, Shauna, I'll start with you. What do you make of those polling numbers?
Well, it's encouraging, right, that people largely, a majority, as we know, believe that gun deaths are preventable. I think the fact that mass shootings really only happen in the United States is a data point, a reality that is really starting to be absorbed by a lot of people, that this is not something we have to accept. Obviously, it's incredibly sad, right, and discouraging that there are any number of people who believe it's something we have to accept. It definitely stems from rhetoric of politicians who are defending access to assault weapons or, at any cost. And I think they're absorbing too that there are real political obstacles to doing what needs to be done. But the truth is, and I think where we need to focus and what matters, is that a majority does believe it's preventable, and that creates space for the gun reform, violence reform laws that we've needed for a long time now.
Yeah, Malik, that 44% of conservatives who don't think anything can be done, do you think that that's an accurate reflection? Do they not think anything can be done, or do they think that things could be done to bring down mass shootings to rates commensurate to those in other similarly, advanced nations, et cetera, but they are unwilling to do the things that distinguish American gun policy from gun policy in other parts of the world?
I think that because of our Second Amendment in the Constitution, America is a little different than some of those other countries as far as what our Constitution allows. I'm not surprised that that number is 44%. I would imagine that a number of people, even though they may be supportive of gun measures, I compare it to, for instance, poverty. All of us want to eliminate poverty. All of us want to eliminate homelessness. But if you ask the question, will the United States ever get to a point where we completely eradicate poverty or homelessness? Probably not. I think that's a realistic assumption, but that should be separate from whether or not you support different gun control measures. And I do know that more and more Republicans are beginning to support different gun control measures, whether or not things like monitoring, forcing social media companies to monitor hate speech. I don't know how that actually tackles the gun problem, but I do expect that more of these proposals will surely come out.
Yeah, the social media stuff really irritates me. That seems like finding someone else to blame and to scapegoat. I mean, social media companies already report actual threats of violence all the time. They're one of the most the companies themselves are one of the most reliable reporters of potentially illegal content and dangerous content to law enforcement. A lot of these the recent mass shootings have been law enforcement failures, to be frank. So I don't know. What are your thoughts, Shauna, on the pivot to, social media needs to do a better job. That's the issue.
I absolutely agree that social media needs to do a better job. It is completely connected. What Hochul is saying, and what she's doing, is saying to social media platforms, you are culpable here too. You need to be transparent about the radicalization of hateful ideologies, and you need to take responsibility. I mean, the number of mass shooters who have engaged in hateful rhetoric, harassment, literally saying online that they will commit acts of violence is staggering. A problem, however, with the law is that Meta, for example, Facebook, Instagram, doesn't actually classify misogyny, literally hatred of women, as hate speech. They treat it as inherently political and a legitimate point of view. We at Ultraviolet, have been demanding that they change that for years now. We have been successful in getting TikTok to ban misogyny. We've gotten Reddit to classify hate speech as misogyny, but they all need to do it because misogyny is a form of hate, period. And if you aren't recognizing it as such, then you're certainly not tracking it. You're not being transparent about that tracking, and you're definitely not reporting it.
Well, I'm not sure exactly, and I don't know that we know the details yet of exactly what is meant by increased monitoring by social media. Of course, these red flag laws are that I think people are broadly supportive of, I think you as well, Robbie, are geared toward catching folks who do say out loud, the way that they often do, that they are planning one of these kinds of attacks. And I do think that it's worthwhile to distinguish the idea of kind of free speech suppression with this idea that people are choosing to volunteer publicly their plans to commit these kinds of acts, and that if they do so, law enforcement should be aware of it and intervene in the way that has been shown to be useful in so many instances. Do you agree with that, Malik?
Yeah, I do. And I think that it is a very different when you're talking about a social media company. And as Robbie said, social media company, they already have reporting requirements. But if you wanted to go the route of holding social media companies accountable, then we're going down the road, which is just what similar people who are proponents of gun reform, what they're talking about is that you hold the gun manufacturer liable. If your guns are used in crimes, then you are able to actually sue the manufacturer. But will that apply to if you use a car to start killing people? I think when we start going down that road, like pinpointing specific things that social media companies need to do beyond what they're already doing, will social media companies ban violent images? Of course, we know there are many instances where young kids or they're on social media and they're brandishing guns. They're brandishing guns that we know are illegal, and they're much younger than the legal age for actually getting those weapons. Will we go down the road of then saying to social media companies that, hey, well, now you have to start banning that as well? I just think it's a very fine line. And I will also say that we should I think that states are able to do many of the things that we kind of always say that the federal government should do. What the governor of New York is doing, I think what she's doing is fine. I think what Florida did when they passed their laws, I think back in 2018, I think that works for the state. The question is whether or not the federal government should come in, big mother or big whatever that's called.
Well, but it's clearly not fine. Look, hate speech is protected speech. There's no category. It's not a category that falls outside of constitutional protection. So if she's saying that social media Governor Hochul saying social media companies have some obligation to purge hate speech.
No. I just want to be really clear. None of that is being said. This is not about.
What she said in
no,
the
this
remarks.
is not about liability. No one brought up liability. She says there needs to be more monitoring. I just want to be really specific about, because we're going a little bit off of what she's actually saying. What she's saying is there needs to be more social media monitoring, which is the kind of thing we've been talking about all week with respect to these red flag laws.
She can't enforce that.
Well, again, we don't know what is being encouraged here, but the idea that she is encouraging police officers to look at folks who are publicly stating that they're planning to do these kind of attacks, is that something that we're saying that we disagree with?
No, please get the police out their butts to actually do something.
The phrasing is more social media monitoring, not holding people liable.
Of social media, or more social media doing monitoring?
Well, I think it's going to be I think the request is that it be on the part of social media.
No, I think she wants to obligate social media to do it. She doesn't want to make her own state employees do it because they never do. No, she wants to totally deputize some company to have to handle this.
I think that is at this point conjecture, but I think both people, as many eyes on these kinds of things as possible, I think would personally be the best outcome given how many of these events are stopped by red flag laws that encourage exactly that kind of behavior.
Governments want social media companies to watch you because they're giving up doing their own jobs, which is to prevent violence. It's not Facebook's job to prevent violence, it's the government's job.
So regardless of whose job it is, do you think it would be socially beneficial for Facebook to alert the police if they see someone who's making credible threats of violence?
Absolutely, and they already do.
Okay, and I think that's what we're talking about, figuring out how to amplify those
hate
efforts.
Speech. And our guest, so I'll bring Shauna back in. Misogynistic, anti-woman speech, terrible, and Facebook and other companies can certainly have policies against it if they want to, but it's not speech that's illegal. So if a government can't force these companies to have those policies.
They sure can't, but misogynists online are a hugely and fast-growing subgroup of the internet, and they are violent. And the internet, specifically the policies that social media platforms currently have in place, are responsible for accelerating and radicalizing disaffected men. There's a direct connection between this and the increase of violence towards women. Social media platforms absolutely have an obligation, and frankly, they are the only ones with access to the tools at the scale necessary to do the monitoring, to make sure that where there are threats of violence, that they can be flagged. That is not something the state can do successfully on its own. It just isn't.
Well, what do you make of that, Malik? Is there an obligation, given that there is not the same access to what's going on in social media, that if these companies build these platforms that are that big and have this kind of influence and profit ultimately from these platforms, do they in fact have an obligation to address some of the implications of it to the extent that there is this relationship between domestic violence and these kinds of issues, misogyny, violence against women and these kinds of issues? There is a pattern that a lot of these mass shooters have been violent toward women in their past. The Uvalde shooter shot his grandmother in the face before going off on his shooting spree. Is there an obligation there born, if from nothing else, the fact that they have the best ability to review and control, unlike, let's say, a local police department?
I think we have to acknowledge that the First Amendment exists for a reason. I think many people would be totally, and they understand that these social media companies, in the instances where they're in these backroom chats or any sort of these rooms and they're saying things that are violent or potentially talking about mass shooters, social media companies should absolutely 100%, they should be able to report that. But if you're talking about misogyny and sexism, there's a lot of hatred on social media, period. I think it's an absolute cesspool, and it's very nasty. There's hate against conservatives, hate against gays, hate against, the LGBT community, hate against liberals. There's a lot of hate online, and I think if we start trying to piecemeal and say, well, the social media companies, they need to focus on misogyny. Well, how do you actually legislate that? Or how do you, from a law enforcement perspective, how do you actually deal with that? I don't think it's possible to deal with things like that.
Has violence against any of the groups you just mentioned gotten worse? There's more of it in the period since social media came about. There's a lot of casually imputing this. It's very trendy to blame social media for literally everything wrong with our society. But I mean, violence against women is a very, very old problem. If it's getting worse and if that's connected to social media, I would like to see some
Is that the metric? Because the shooter, the Buffalo shooter himself said that he was radicalized by.
Well, but now we're taking the handful of mass shootings again, right? Most acts of violence against women or against anyone are not done in the context of what we saw in Buffalo.
Right, but if we're having a policy
or
conversation about how to address these mass shootings, I think it's fair to say that if someone admits that technology was part of the process of them being radicalized.
But if 99% of the violence has nothing to do with that kind of thing, aren't we
if you're one of the 44% of conservatives who think that there's nothing to be done about this, so we shouldn't change anything, then that's fine.
But I think I think that's an unfair characterization. I don't think that they said that nothing should be done. It's essentially what I said. You're accepting that these things, as unfortunate as they are, these things will occur. I don't think that that's the same as conservatives saying that nothing's a problem and nothing can be done. I think that mischaracterizes the conservative position on that.
I think that's a good point, and I also think that many leftists have pointed out that people said the same thing, like you said, about homelessness and child poverty. They've halved child poverty through a policy intervention in the course of the pandemic. They let it expire, doubling child poverty. And I think it's notable that people are learning that a lot of things that we say can't be done and can't be changed actually can. And it's about political will, policy choices, and our ethical, personal choices. I'll let you have the last word here, Shauna.
Well, I do want to say there is quite a bit of research out there, which is why you're hearing so many more people talk about the connection between misogyny, racism, and the increase of violence towards women, and particularly women of color. There was a report I would point folks to that Everytown for Gun Violence published just earlier this year. I believe it's called Misogyny, Extremism, and the Rise of Gun Violence. That's one example, but there are many academics who have been looking at this for a long time and have been publishing more recently about the impact of social media and increasing violence toward women. This is not a trendy talking point. It is a research and data-driven narrative that is designed to make elites finally in government and also social media platforms accept responsibility for what they've helped create and take misogyny seriously.
Well, thank you to our guests so much for having this debate. Shauna and Malik, we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Coming up, cancel culture strikes again after the Washington Post suspended an employee for retweeting an offensive tweet. I am looking forward to discussing that coming up next.